So, as the World Migration Report 2020 suggests, India continues to be the largest country of origin of international migrants, with 17.5 million of Indians living abroad, followed by Mexico and China. Now, while the top destination country for the Indians is still the USA, quite a few countries have been added to the list, for example, Canada, Germany, and so on. And this is something in view of the massive scale of emigration that India demonstrates, one is really inquisitive regarding the latest migration status of Indians, be it skilled, unskilled, semi-skilled, of all varieties, in the present context, especially in the present context of the pandemic. Now, therefore, with the coronavirus pandemic playing havoc with the economy all over the world, apart from other societal and health-specific hazards, of course, the need of the hour is to explore how and to what extent is the COVID-19 responsible for impacting the scale of skilled migration from India and internal migration within the country. And for making that exploration happen, we have four very erudite panelists with us today. And I'm very thankful to each of them for taking their time out and participating in the panel discussion. So all our panelists have been working extensively in the fields of migration, labor, economy. Professor Binod Khadria, an economist from JNU and also presently at SGT University, has produced volumes of work on skilled migration from India to the USA and to the Gulf region. Professor Sunder Ramaswamy, the Vice Chancellor of Krea University, and also an economist with extensive works on developmental economics and sustainability. Dr. Carsten Butsch, a human geographer and my colleague from the University of Cologne, with very significant economic contribution to the emerging Indian diaspora in Germany. And Mr. Saif Khalid, a journalist with the Al Jazeera, with phenomenal field experiences on the long walk that these migrants took in India during the national lockdown. So with this power-packed and a very accomplished panel with us today, please allow me to welcome all of you to the fourth session of Corona Conversations, Mobility in a Post-COVID Future, where we ask and we explore how will the future of skilled migration look like in a post-COVID situation. Before we formally begin, there are just a few things I would like to mention regarding the session today. Firstly, today's session is split between a panel discussion followed by an open house. And the panel discussion will be of about 45-50 minutes and the open house will be of about 20 minutes. But in case we need a couple of minutes extra, we have the liberty to do so. And the panel discussion is going to be recorded, but the open house will not be recorded. And all these recordings will be available in the GSSC website for later. So please do not take pictures or record any portion of the session. You will be able to find them later in the GSSC website. Now, regarding interacting with the panel, with the panelists in the open house, I would request you to hold your questions and as we open the house, you could press the raise your hand button and then introduce yourself briefly and ask the question or you share your comments. And in case of a technical glitch because of which you are unable to do so, then you may please write the questions in the chat box and we will be taking them up. So this is largely the structural specifics regarding the session today. And now let me start formally with the panel discussion. So I would like to start with Mr. Khalid. Mr. Khalid, you covered the long walks of the wage laborers in India from cities to villages at the onset of a national lockdown. Now, a lot of them were construction workers, domestic health, small entrepreneurs, casual workers, etc. So later we also heard that government has very little data to estimate the numbers. But however, there is no denying the fact that all of us witnessed this on television or maybe out on the street, how people left the cities on foot and to reach their home states, and then they died in the process, a lot of them. So a lot of hardships. So, as a journalist, could you tell us a little bit about your experience of witnessing and chronicling, documenting that from ground zero, this entire episode of return migration, and how would you locate this phenomena within the larger context of a pandemic?
Hello, hi. Thank you for the introduction. Uh, I'll start. When Prime Minister Modi said that he's going to address the nation, uh, so on Twitter, people were mocking that, now we are going, we are going to prepare for something, uh, and it, it went on similar lines. He gave 4 hours notice, and he locked down the country. Uh, we are an international website. We cover the entire region. No country witnessed this scale of migration in such a short span of time. And we can uh, discuss the merits of the government, um, on why it took the decision, and whether there were other means or ways to go for it. But what it did, that it created, it turned a pandemic crisis into a humanitarian situation. And while we were covering the issue, uh, it was the people's misery. People were facing hunger while walking. Hundreds of people died on railway tracks, on roads, and for not just for days, but for weeks, the government was in denial. Um, at least, even if the government was working out something for them, there was very little communication, number one, and there was no transparency on what exactly it was doing. The reason is that just a week or two before the lockdown, which was announced on March 24, uh, the government's, India's health minister is on record to say that there is no medical emergency in India due to pandemic, despite the fact that, by then I think WHO had already announced that it was a pandemic. So just in a span of just 2 weeks, the government goes for the strictest lockdown in the world. And it also, I'll come back to the problems which people face. But one of the things it exposes is the lack of imagination of the government, and probably they didn't have idea that India has so many migrants living in their cities. And probably that was very shocking, that probably government didn't anticipate that, it will create exodus of that scale, you know. And that is something we won't know, like whether government knew or not, but definitely government was in a shock. For 50 days, government couldn't do anything, or at least it didn't seem to be working out a solution, until the Supreme Court had to order that the government has to provide some mode of transportation. So then the train services were started. And initially, even for the train services, migrants were being charged. So uh, that on the part of the government, it was, I think, a major lapse on the part of the government. Now, coming back to the personal stories of migrants, um, the kind of crisis we saw, like, in South Asia, we have Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, which are compared to India in terms of income, in terms of their level of prosperity. They're not close to India anywhere. India is a huge economy. But despite that, the kind of crisis which India saw was unprecedented and overwhelming. And it also calls for and the other thing which is significant here is that why people were uh, taken aback, why it was so surprising that so many people were on the roads, is also a reflection on the way our media reports the issues of the country. uh, there is there is a sense of detachment from the reality. especially in the past several years, with a very nationalistic tinge to show India a very powerful country. I think there is a tendency among the media, and definitely government likes this, not to show those things, like India is not to show India in what we in journalism terms and negative stories. Um, so that was actually on display when millions, finally government admitted that 10 millions migrants actually moved. That's a huge number.
Yeah.
And according to a survey last year, it says that around 100 million India's internal migrants are around 100 million. So out of that, 10% actually moved. And the other thing, one of the positive sides of that was that while they were walking on foot, there was this girl called Jyoti Yadav, Dalit girl. She took her father on her cycle and pedaled more than 1,000 kilometers to reach her home. She caught international media headlines, and she has been showered with a lot of goodies and rewards from politicians, from philanthropy organization. Uh, but it also shows that the institutional response has been lacking, while it is more of a the help came in the form of philanthropy here and there, while the larger institutional reasons for this has not been addressed, and it has and that is something which might repeat itself in the future if those are not addressed. Uh, there was this uh, uh, situation in which I personally followed. So there was this auto rickshaw uh, driver from a place called Nashik near Mumbai.
Yeah.
He used to earn around 300 to 500 rupees per day. So in the morning, NDTV, a local channel, showed his story that in his auto, he was traveling from Nasik to a place in northern Uttar Pradesh state called Sitapur, which is almost 1,500 kilometers. Um, just 4 hours later, reports came that a car basically rammed through his auto, and he died in that incident. Um, that was really heartbreaking. So his wife survived, and his two children. I spoke to his wife. She was held by the local journalists from NDTV. Till now, she has not received a uh, single help from the government, no compensation. Uh, Government left them to fend for themselves. Now she is alone, and she has her two sons. She told me that I want to educate my sons. Obviously she comes from a very poor family, so neither her in-laws nor her parents are in a position to help her. So this is one example I'm giving, but there are tens of thousands of cases where the families have been ripped apart. The breadwinners were killed for no faults of their. Police resorted to brutality. It has been documented. They behaved as if these were criminals or it was a law and order situation. So all these things were happening while uh, because the government somehow failed to grasp the situation, um, and the government's only agenda was to stop people from moving. If we compare that with the neighboring countries, much poorer countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, they took their step in gradually. They gave people some time, and as a result, actually that actually worked for those societies, and also in terms of fatalities. If you see Pakistan and Bangladesh, and even Nepal. Um, uh, the fatalities were not that high, despite the fact that the lockdown was not very swift and sudden. Um, so that is my observation of of the incident which I covered. I also handled a lot of reporters on the ground. Government ultimately was forced to admit that it was a major crisis. Uh, so it announced billions of dollars of food aid for the workers. But the problem with that was that many of those workers were not eligible because of the digital discrepancy. So their name was
Right.
not in the, card. The government of Delhi said that they will be issuing e-coupons, but that was
Yes.
only accessible through mobile phones. And many of the people had no mobile phone, or those who had, they couldn't, download or, access that. So that actually uh, was also the fact that governments in recent years, and this is not about one government, because India has many states, and the state authorities are actually the ones who actually act on them. So it turned out, it actually gave the impression that the government was insensitive towards the poor, while these people are the major contributor to the economy.
Right.
Their work, their contribution to the economy is not less, while their influence in policy making is negligible. And that is the
Yes.
reason why this thing happened, because they had no idea. They didn't know how to react, how to handle them. Probably the government didn't have idea how many migrants live in the city and in what situation they live. Most of them were not paid by the employers, so they were facing hunger. They had no choice but to go back to their homes. So these are my impression of what I saw those several weeks. It continued for 3 months. People kept on walking and going on. There was an incident where the train lost its way. Uh, it was like, unbelievable state or administrative apathy towards the poorest section of India's society. And uh, uh, I think it needs to be, this came as an occasion when the policymakers, even the media, needs to look into the reality of the country, and uh, bring the poor, the marginalized, into to make them as a stakeholders in the nation's development. These highbrow concepts, and in the in terms of coining terms and slogans for the economy, like 5 trillion economy, and terms like that. These are good to boost the morals of the cadres, but you have to also take into consideration the realities, and the sections which are actually the real contributors to the economy. So I would, uh, that's what I wanted to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Khalid. It really, I mean, it's fascinating to hear from you these personal stories, and also to understand, to the admin apathy, as you were saying, against these people, and to the extent that these wage laborers, when they went back to their villages, a lot of people like Jyoti Yadav, as you were saying, and maybe a lot of people never also want to come back, never want to return to the cities. Now, on this note, let me now turn to Professor Khadria. Professor Khadria, your work is extensively on labor migration and mobility across different countries, and you work both on high skill and low skill laborers from India to different countries like the Gulf countries, the USA. Now, we just heard Mr. Khalid talk about the situation of the low-skilled migrants, in the internal migrants in India. So expanding now our scope of conversation from internal to international, I'm wondering how is the situation of the low-skilled Indian migrants in the Gulf countries, during the pandemic, and I mean, during the lockdown especially, and now, and are they planning to return? Did they return then? Are they planning to go back? What is it like? And how is it? How do you compare their situation their status with the current status of the Indian high-skilled migrants in the USA?
You're still muted. I think you have to turn on the mic.
Okay, so I should begin by saying thanks to Amrita, and I would say Khalid had, reminded us of the situation that started with the lockdown being announced by the Prime Minister in the last week of March. I should also mention that you started by talking about the Indian diaspora, 17.5 million in the World Migration Report. And by the way, I happen to be one of the co-editors.
I know that, yes.
Also, in the first week of April, I published a piece in the Down to Earth magazine about the Indian internal migration. And that was almost reminiscent, the rush for the transportation on the buses, on the trains and so on, and walking was reminiscent of India's partition in 1947. That was a tragic story, just to add. But 100 million, as Khalid had said, 100 million Indian migrants is much larger than the Indian diaspora, 17.5 million across the world, which is just about 2% of India's population, less than that. If we look at Gulf countries, if we look at Indian diaspora, it's a high skilled, low skilled, medium skilled, all kinds, and geographically their distribution is very much divided. As you said rightly, United States and the developed countries, global north, are the destination for mostly the high skilled people, whereas Gulf countries and Southeast Asia and East Asia also, mostly but Gulf countries, they are semi-skilled and unskilled workers. That started with the oil phenomenon in the 70s and then picked up in the 80s when the infrastructure development started there. And so the current estimate is about 8 to 9 million, roughly half of the Indian diaspora is in the Gulf countries. And the stories are similar. The discrimination and the apathy, the indifference during any crisis was evident in the context of the COVID-19 also. And that is what has been, very much evident in the way these migrant workers, both male and female, there are a large number of domestic workers who are mostly women. We see that the miseries were both physical and mental were widespread. The reason being that the difference between internal migration that Khalid explained, narrated, gets multiplied when you are in another country, because you are controlled by the visa rules, by entry, exit, and all that. And particularly the Gulf migrant workers who are mostly without families, as compared to in the West who are also with their families, they face the problem of all the exploitation and shortcomings of the labor market, the labor laws and the labor regulations, which are not complied with. First of all, they don't exist, and even where they exist, they are not complied with in terms of the protection and safeguard to the workers. That, I think, is one major difference that one comes up. And the living conditions, the kind of living conditions, the cramped housing, and the very unfavorable climatic conditions of high temperatures actually multiplied these miseries, added to these miseries. The amount of roughly about, you see, first of all, both countries, India and as well as the destination countries, the Gulf countries, the 6 GCC countries, Gulf Cooperation Council, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, all these countries, barring some differences across these countries, were not providing them any facility to go out of the country, whereas more than 50% of these people were COVID positive. They did not have testing facilities. They did not have any kind of health, access to the health services, and they did not have insurance. The insurance business in the Gulf countries has been very much varied. Sometimes it is by the employer, sometimes by the recruitment agent, and most of the time it is passed on to the migrant himself or herself. At some point in time, India did devise some of the policies to look after the migrant workers, particularly in the Gulf countries, and that started mostly after the 2003, rather 2004, when the Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs was put in place as a result of the report of the on the Indian diaspora that was, that came out. And in fact, the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, the Indian Expatriates Day was started from 2003 onwards, celebrating on the day Mahatma Gandhi returned from South Africa to India. But all those stories aside, when the crisis hit, all the new policies that government had placed, and tried to implement in terms of providing protection and safeguard to Indian migrant workers in the Gulf, did not come of much help at that point in time. Subsequently, of course, 10%, again 10%, which is the parallel returnees from the Gulf also, as in internal migration that Khalid had said, could come back to India through the special evacuation Air India flights called the Vande Bharat. It was unfortunate that one of the flights carrying almost 300 passengers crashed while landing in the bad weather.
Right.
But other than that, about half of the locked half of the people in that region could come back to India. And it is anticipated that probably over time the remaining half would also come back. This happened because they were laid off, because they did not have, contracts were not renewed. And what was appalling was that their wages were not paid. So many of them just came back empty-handed. Their arrears of wages were not paid to them. That was not reflected in the remittances. Although it is anticipated by World Bank and others that there would be a drastic fall in the remittances. And one of the originating region for remittances, India is the topmost receiving country in the world, 83 billion last year. And it is anticipated that it would dip down by 23%. But half of this comes from the Gulf countries. So that actually, it is interesting to see that remittance actually went up, because these people were coming back to India bag and baggage. So whatever savings they had at their disposal, they brought it back with them, or sent it through the banking channels or Hawala channels and others. So there was a surge in remittances, but that was deceptive in a way, because the future stream, the flow, the stock of remittances came, but the future flow was drying up. That is a contradiction. And how are they going to spend this money? They don't know. They have no direction, no guidance. And so it would either sit in the bank idle, earning low interest rates, or it would go into conspicuous consumption. And there are conflicts, wheels within wheels because there's no reintegration policy. First of all, the stigma of these people coming back, and this happened in internal migration also. At the doorstep of the villages in the rural India, they said, don't come, you are carrying COVID-19 infection. You're not welcome here, stay out. Same thing happened with the Gulf migrants. When they came back home, there were no avenues for jobs. So I think it was a chaotic situation, and which was natural, but there were not enough safeguards that were erected in time. That, I think, is something which probably would go down in history as a tragic chapter of migration. If we look at these developed countries, for example, the global north countries, as you said, United States of America, that, you see, also had its own kind, because United States of America had the maximum incidence of COVID infections.
Yes.
So people were afraid, there's a lot of fear psychosis apart from actual physical harm and physical kind of infection. There was trauma that was there. And added to that was the immigration policy, the executive orders by the president that were very much anti-immigrant. And that's where, in the name of saving livelihood of the American citizens, the processing of green card was stopped, with the exception that health workers, the COVID warriors, the doctors and nurses will be exempt from that. That is going to adversely affect the brain drain, because you are making a discrimination, and that would trigger further migration of these scarce human capital from the global south to the global north again. That is something which it takes long time to establish, but undoing it is not easy. It is another matter that now that the regime has changed in the United States, likely to change, one hopes so, that things would be different, that things would again be more viable and comfortable and predictable. What is important is that if they're not predictable, if their uncertainty continues, then you cannot take decisions. The families remain split. The families cannot get united because people were, stranded. Families were stranded, and students were stranded. Students, when the F1 visa was also at stake, high stake, that if you are attending, if you have taken admission and you are going in for online courses rather than physical courses, face-to-face courses, then you will not be allowed to come into the territory of the United States. It's another matter that, the Ivy League universities, as well as the top multinational corporations like Amazon, like Google and others, they threatened that they will go to court, that this was not implemented. But otherwise, the students were alarmed because they had paid the fees, the tuition fees were paid, huge amounts of money, which had gone from the pockets of the parents, were not refundable. And then they would lose their whole year, and they don't know where the future lies. So those were the moments of trauma, moments of insecurity, moments of uncertainty. And I think this pandemic has been truly a pandemic in that sense, that it did not leave anybody out of it. In that sense, it was a great equalizer. It has been a great equalizer in that sense. But when it comes to its effect, the intensity of the effect is more on the poor people and less on those who have the resources to get health care, to get protection, or to have the livelihood. So the conflict between life and the livelihood, that balance was very, very tricky. And we see that all over the world, we do have examples where countries, some of the countries have handled this in a very wise manner, in a very, very careful manner. Some countries have not. And this is where I think the typical Indian way of handling or becoming wise after the event is very much evident, both in the case of internal migration and international migration. I think one can go on, but looking at the clock, I think it is time that I just stop it here.
Right. So thank you so much. I mean, what you were saying is it's very interesting that, internal migrants, internal migration and international migration, how stark similarities in terms of, the problems and the challenges that the internal migrants in India face, and in the Gulf countries, the international migrants from India also faced, and when they return. So that is something really interesting. And of course, we could go on, but I would right now move on to Dr. Butsch. And Dr. Butsch, Professor Khadria talked about the uncertainty in migration policies, which affects the entire experiences of migrants, especially in a pandemic. And you have been researching on the Indian communities in Germany, and you're now looking at the impact of COVID on them. So from that standpoint, let me ask you, is the situation of the Indian migrants in Germany any different from that of in America or in the Gulf countries? And keeping in mind that the Gulf regions, most of them are the low-skilled migrants, but in India, in Germany, most of the Indians are high-skilled migrants. So how would you locate their COVID-specific life, and what are the big changes that have happened in the last 8-9 months for them since COVID struck Germany?
Yes. Can I share my screen to illustrate a few points?
Yes,
Is it possible?
please. Most
Okay.
welcome.
I'm sharing a presentation which I gave. I didn't prepare it specifically for today, but I gave that presentation a couple of weeks ago. What I wanted to show is to answer this question. I think what is different in Germany is that we have different waves of migration from India to Germany. And you can actually identify different phases in which different types of migrants came. So it ends in 2015, but I think the most things will be clear from that. We have a phase in the 1950s when the volume of migrants was very small, where it was mainly students, mostly from Bengal, and some high-skilled people who came. Then we had a phase where we had a very unique migration from India to Germany, and that was nurses, mainly from Kerala, who migrated through a network of the Catholic Church. They were working here in hospitals, and when you look at the Indian diaspora in Germany, this is still one group which is there, those nurses and their husbands, and they are now in their late 60s and 70s. Then there's one group they claimed to seek asylum. They were coming mainly from Punjab and said they claimed asylum because of the events which took place in the 70s and 80s around the Khalistan movement. And then migration to Germany changed rapidly from the year 2000 onwards, where we had two major events. The one event was that the German government invited IT professionals to Germany, and they had something which they called green card, but which was not a green card in the true sense as the American green card is, but it was a temporary way of coming. But that initiated an exchange in that high-skilled migration sector to Germany. So since the 2000s, the number of IT professionals coming to Germany has increased, and through that, actually, Germany became a field of Indian IT companies, Tata Consultancy Services, and Infosys, you name them, they all have now tens of thousands of people working in Germany and providing services for the medium-sized enterprises in Germany, which are the backbone of our economy. Everybody knows about Daimler, knows about Siemens, and they are surely important, but the backbone of the German economy are the medium-scaled enterprises. That is something which is very unique about Germany. But those companies have very little professional IT capacities, and so they very much rely on Indian IT coming here. So there is actually a big demand of those people, and that is reflected in the numbers. Compared to the US or the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, this is of course much less, but we have now roughly 120,000 Indians in Germany, and a good number of them are also students. You can also say 15,000, so let's say 10% of that group would be students. So what I wanted to show you is basically these people come here and they have a very secure legal status. They are some of them are hired by the Indian contractor, but still, if you are employed, if you set foot here in an office, you have to be employed, you have to have a health insurance, and you have a very safe status actually. Things like which are described for the Gulf Cooperation Councils, where you can easily be expelled and things like that, are not possible here. So the people have a very secure status. However, the life of the people, and this is shown in this graph here, is they have an idea of life, because they come to Germany and stay only in a very short time span, and they visit their families regularly, and their life, the way they live their life, is that they always have the feeling that they can go home the next day. In my interviews, people told me, look, if I want to be in India, I grab my suitcase and I'm home in 9 hours latest. Okay, that's the way how they lived. They lived a truly transnational life. They lived very closely connected to the companies they worked for in India, but also their families. Okay, and I think I can stop my presentation here, because that was mainly the point which I wanted to make. And this transnational lives, that security of being always able to go home whenever it's needed, when their parents were in need, when there was a crisis or something, that was suddenly stopped. Things that were the norm, going back each summer holiday to the family, keeping your social networks alive like that, this has suddenly stopped. And I think the point which Professor Khadria made about uncertainty, that is actually the main point about the whole discussion. When we look at migration, certain networks and practices have emerged in the last years. And those networks and practices were always around flexibility and mobility. And the pandemic actually set hard borders. So within Germany, there's no problem. Those people can live here. But if you are retired, for example, those people from the generation of the Indian nurses who used to spend the summers in Germany and after retirement, their winters in India, that whole model of life does not work anymore. So I think in future, people will be forced to take a decision to either live in Germany or either live in India. And that whole model of sending people quickly for a couple of weeks if there's a need, or even sending someone for a year, what is happening usually with the IT professionals, then the highly paid professional will ask, okay, but can you guarantee me that I'll be able to go home again? So that uncertainty which is there in international migration, I think that is something, I cannot provide an answer, but I think that's the question. When we talk about future, how will people who are potential migrants react to that? And that does not only apply to the high-skilled migrants, but that also applies to the other examples mentioned, for example, the students. If you want to go to the US and make an investment, A, and B, physically go there, then you want to be sure that your investment pays out, and B, that you will be able to come back home one day.
Right.
And these certainties, all these regulations, they are lost. And I think that uncertainty will change international migration, at least for a couple of years. I think that globalization is so intense that we will see a backdrop, so international migration will go up again. But I also think that more things, especially for those people who are in the IT sector, will become more digital. So some of the movements will be replaced by digital solutions. That's my guess at the moment. But let's see, there's a lot of work to do.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Butsch. As of course, I mean, as you and Professor Khadria both pointed out, how uncertainty, defines and also exemplifies the entire experience of the migrants in this pandemic situation, possibly in a post-pandemic situation. We'll come to that a little later. For the moment, I would like to turn to Professor Ramaswamy. Professor Ramaswamy, as an economist, witnessing the immediate impacts of the pandemic on labor migration all across the world, how would you assess the effect of this global lockdown and the post-lockdown reopening, on the movement of labor, be it internal movements in India or international labor movements and mobility in general? what is your general observation? How did the lockdown affect labor migration across the world in general?
Thank you, Amrita, and for the first of all, the arranging this series, and also for my fellow distinguished panelists. That's a big question, but if you permit me to provide a little bit of context to the question.
Sure.
So I want to pull together a few strands. You know, the last 4 or 5 years has been an incredibly disruptive phase in whether you look at global polity or global economics or global affairs. You know, and let me go back to maybe 2013 or 14 when Tom Piketty's book came out about capital and the rise of inequality that he talks about both within countries and across countries. And the more inequality you have results in political and social instability. And one interesting trend over the last 20 years is that the share of labor in GDP, whether globally or within countries like India, is falling quite dramatically, which means labor has been getting worse off, right? So that's the second observation that I think it's important to keep in mind. And then we started with massive disruptions with Brexit in 2016 and the mother of all disruptions in the election of Donald Trump, which, as Professor Khadria said, may be a one-term president, but we will see in January 20th, you know, which prompted Condoleezza Rice, the former Secretary of State, to talk about the rise of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, as she puts it 2 years ago, which was populism, isolationism, nativism, and protectionism, right? So these 4 horsemen have certainly reared their ugly heads and sort of pushing back the liberal global order. And whether it is Trump's America First, which essentially is America isolationism, but there's a trend to what Condi Rice is talking about, because you see these resurgence of populism and isolationism and nativism and protectionism across the globe, and especially in many, many of the bigger countries, which is unusual. So all of this is happening in the last 4 or 5 years. And of course, then you come to the good old 2020, where we are literally witnessing 3 unfolding crises. The first being the global pandemic, which we are still not out of. The second is the economic lockdown and the associated slowdown and meltdown of the economies globally and in countries like India, where India has lost about 25% of its GDP already. And the third is, you know, what started out in the US as a Black Lives Matter, or in Europe as anti-colonialism, and in India, as Khalid, Mr. Khalid mentioned, the social justice, which has been with us all the time, but it erupts when the migrants couldn't get home, right? So we are dealing with a global health crisis, an economic crisis, and a social justice crisis, all of which in 2020. So in some ways, it's been a bookend of 5 years of disruptions at a time when labor itself has been losing its share relative to capital. And you know what is interesting as an economist, the broader trends in the 4th industrial revolution, which is the bigger backdrop against which all of this is unfolding, is that we are witnessing jobless growth, jobless wealth creation because of AI and machine learning and replacement of labor with unskilled labor, either with skilled labor or with machines, that not only is the share of labor falling, then the wages are also declining. And so it makes for a perfect storm in some way that, you know, economists have talked about V-shaped recessions and W-shaped recessions, and now we are introducing a new letter of the alphabet, K-shaped recession. So in other words, the people who have the skills, such as people on this call who can get on a Zoom call and have skills that are transferable across fiber optics, will do well. And then those who need to be physically present, whether it's hospitality sector or construction laborers and so on, that's the K-shape. They're going to see their fortunes decline, while the fortunes of the people in the top portion of the skill bracket or the income bracket will go up. And that's the K shape, right? And not only is there a K shape that's between the developed countries and the emerging markets, but within emerging markets, there's a K shape between the haves and the have-nots, right? So I think all of this is unfolding as we speak, and it'll get us into 2021. And at a time when, human population is upwards of 7-odd billion, and India is sitting with 1.3 and may cross China in about 20 years. And I think, I forget whether it was Mr. Khalid or Dr. Khadria who talked about the share of the migrants is far bigger than the diaspora. So I think it's the combination of technology that's unfolding before all of this started, and that we are still going to see the inexorable force of the fourth industrial revolution continue, which puts more and more premium on who can adopt a gig economy, who can be part of this, and who is going to be left behind. And the state is really not in any position, especially the Indian state, is not in any position to provide social safety nets for these large portion of the migrants or the portion on the lower end of the population that's going to slide down the lower bar of that K when the lockdowns continue to get lifted and the economy starts to pull back up. So it's an alarming worry that the recession, we were a bit more optimistic many months ago that it could be a very fast V shape. And in fact, Prime Minister Modi a year ago was talking about creating a $5 trillion economy by 2025. All of that becomes pipe dreams. Because right now, the question in a country like India is, of course, how do we get handle on the COVID crisis itself? And of course, there is some hope with the result of the vaccines. But beyond that, because of the social safety net that's been so badly frayed, and the fact that jobs are not coming back that quickly,
Right.
And migrants may not physically move, right? And they may not even be welcomed. So as somebody said, when they went back, they were stigmatized. I mean, all of this is going to play out, I think, in 2021. It reminds me of a comment that a Swedish prime minister is supposed to have made in the early 90s when he said, we want your labor, we just don't want your workers, right? And that made no sense 20 years ago when you couldn't separate labor from the worker. But now it is possible because there are things that one can deliver over the internet without having to physically move. So how this shapes out, whether the person has to physically move. Now, certain jobs, yes, construction, hospitality, maybe you have, even then I think you'll have to break it down because there may be certain parts of the construction industry, or there may be certain parts of the hospitality industry where you can actually sit in one place and commit your labor in another place. So I think we have to break down these clunky labels we have between blue collar and white collar and skilled and unskilled, and think about what parts of a job actually becomes mobile and what parts of the job can be done sitting in one place, or as they call work from anywhere. It's not even work from home anymore, right? And so I think all of this is happening as we speak. All of this will get shaken out. But I think the trends that Piketty outlines, the trends that share of labor has been dropping for the last 20 years, that is not going to miraculously change. So I think the bottom line is workers are going to get shorter and shorter shrift, especially as even the recovery happens. And then the question is whether the government, in concert with the private sector or the public sector, is able to create the jobs that create the opportunities for people to bootstrap themselves. Otherwise, the slide down that lower bar of the K becomes even more alarming, and the gap between the haves and the have-nots becomes even more. And that's the worst thing you can happen in a developing country, is to have these islands of excellence and opportunities surrounded by a sea of deprivation. And I think that is where we have to be really careful and cautious, because India still remains a vibrant democracy, and to maintain economic order, especially not coming at the expense of social unrest and political unrest, will become the call of the day as we head into the new year of 2021. So that's the trends I see both globally, and I'm part of a huge project looking on global, what we call jobless growth in Asia, looking at 17 countries across Asia. And these trends have been there maybe for 4 or 5 years, predating 2020. And 2020 is going to exacerbate some of these even more. And the last thing maybe I'll end with is I've just sort of talked about the difference between unskilled and skilled and mobile and immobile labor. But I think there is a gender dimension to all of this, and the labor force participation of women in a country like India or in the developing world. And because the burden of lockdown has been faced by women disproportionately, this has to be really addressed in terms of the women's, the impact of lockdowns, and in particular the recovery, and what does it do for gender labor force participation? Because prior to that, steps had been taken to increase their participation and increase their wage income, and all of that, I think we have lost ground in the last 7 months. So I'll stop here and open to questions.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. A lot of reflections in terms of how can we separate labor, can we at all separate labor from the worker, and also the gender dimension in terms of mobile and immobile labor. I will now very quickly go for a last round with all of you with one very simple question. And I will begin with Mr. Khalid. How is the future going to look like in terms of this internal migrants who left the cities, and also some of them decided never to return actually? But do you think that, they are now gradually, as the economy is opening, they're returning, or how is it going to look like in future? Mr. Khalid.
Hello, hi. Regarding the statement which was reported in the media, when the workers and migrants were returning, they pledged that they will never return back. But that's not the option they have, back in the villages, the situation is not well. The only job available in the rural areas is through the employment guarantee scheme, which is a central government scheme. And that also, as Professor Badaria and Dr. Ramaswamy also pointed out, that there was also a case of stigmatization. So many of them were actually not allowed to participate in the job process. And plus the number of jobs are limited. According to government data, I think they have provided around 60 jobs to around 60 million people through the employment guarantee scheme. But I would like to highlight one of the, when it was being reported that, laborers won't come, many people, particularly economists, pointed out that, okay, it was more of an emotional outburst, but the workers in India do not have actually much of option. They have very small land holdings, so agriculture doesn't support them. And other significant reality in India is the source of migrant laborers. So there are 3-4 states which include West Bengal, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and Orissa. There's a huge number of migrants actually come from these. In fact, half of the 10 million migrants who returned, they came from Bihar and UP. So it's a massive, and these are the states where there is absolutely no industry, and there is very little optimism that there will be actually job creation. In states like Bihar, where the state went to elections just a couple of months ago. The job was not even a job was a major issue in that election, and that job was not about industry or about employment. It was just about government jobs. So that is a sad reality when it comes to migrants in India. And so couple of things which I wanted to point out. One is that a lot of migrants who are returning, they have lost bargaining power because there are few jobs than before. So many of those who worked in a skilled, say in garment industry, or as carpenters, as different mechanics in factories, they're working as loaders, or even like just as unskilled laborers in odd works. So what is experts have called it a process of de-skilling. So they have no choice but to just do any job available. And the other thing which I said, that they have lost the bargaining power. The other interesting phenomenon which we saw, that some of the some NGOs, actually non-profit organizations, worked in imparting new skills to the migrants. So, for example,
Right.
mobile repair and motor mechanic. So what has happened, that many of the laborers or migrants who could afford or who could get training, for example, a non-profit called Ajivika, they trained some people in Rajasthan. Actually, they opened their shops in their villages, and that actually worked wonders, because mobile repair, everyone has a mobile. So and there are many people who can repair them. So that is the positive side of this, that people have some alternative ways of employment, but largely jobs are, as the experts have just talked about, that jobs aren't there, jobs are not being created, and the economy is turning into what we know as gig economy. So a lot of jobs are going
Right.
online. So for workers, there very little opportunity to basically get the kind of jobs which are being created, and even those are not in big numbers. So and the last point, which also Dr. Ramaswamy highlighted, is the gender question. So women, in general, women's participation in India is low. It's, I think, 23%. It has further gone down. And I was reading a report from UP, where basically it looked at the beauty industry. So in India, it employs around 7 million people, mostly women, and they have been badly affected, because it's a personal enterprise. Either you have your own parlor or you work there. It has been hugely affected, not just because of the lockdown, but also post-lockdown. People don't want to go. People are avoiding because of infections, fear of infections. So in a nutshell, the situation, the laborers have actually returned. Many of them have returned wherever they could. It's not a question of not going back. Very few people, those who are lucky enough to be trained, have started their own stuff, and rest are still waiting to be hired. In fact, in many cases, I have read that many of the workers were actually actually asked by their employers to come back and join the work, but their situation, their working conditions didn't change. So, but they cannot go back. They have absolutely no idea. So it's a grim situation. I mean, I'm not a policymaker. I hope the government is looking into it, how to address this situation. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Khalid. As you said, de-skilling and perhaps maybe reskilling is something that is going to be the future. We'll come to that a little later. For the moment, Professor Khadria, how do you envisage the future of the Indian migrants in the USA? I mean, you said that with the change of regime from Trump to now Biden, one hopes that there is a change in the policy structures as also. So. What is your opinion in terms of the next 10, 20 years of the future of Indian migrants in the USA?
Well, crystal ball gauging is always risky in terms of predictions. They may or may not come out to be true, but at the same time, as I said, like uncertainty drives us. It is also the predictability or prediction or expectations that drives our activities. So in that sense, I think uh, it is a ray of hope for the migrants after what they had seen in the last 4 years, the Trump regime. So from that point of view, if we look at United States of America, then of course, it's going to be a shift of gear again, because already the change has been evident in terms of the Honduras migrants who were given the, protection and were being threatened for deportation by the Trump regime has been undone by even before the Biden-Harris team has taken over. So similarly, for example, H-4 visa for spouses of H-1B visa holders was going to be scrapped. It is another matter that did not take place during the Trump regime, so perhaps that would not happen. And so I think green card applications and others, one thinks that 198 years of wait for Indians to get that visa or that kind of green card uh, is no longer that kind of fear is there, because, for example, the country-based quota
Right.
of the green cards is going to be waived, perhaps. So there are going to be paradigm shifts in this area. What I foresee, for example, I foresee that in the case of the United States, which is for the final destination, about 12% of India's diaspora is in the United States. What I foresee is that students also make one category.
Right.
Huge numbers of Indian students are studying in the United States of America. Their choices in terms of streams are going to change. They're going to be more medical oriented, more HRH, human resource in health. That is happening, and STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Because I look at them as two sides of, say, crisis handling of a pandemic like COVID type. Um, I look at, say, the medical fields, doctors, nurses, nursing, or becoming a doctor, becoming a nurse, and so on. These are professions which are more curative in terms of ex post facto, actions can be taken in terms of handling the medical emergencies. That is going to be very, very important, so that if another crisis strikes after COVID-19, then, that is to some extent better equipped. On the other hand, STEM fields are going to be curative. That's like vaccine. That's like a vaccine invention is not only by doctors. It is a team effort of the STEM field people. Even mathematicians are important in those. Scientists are important. So that is going to be the curative kind of profession, where there will be a rush for from both the demand and the supply side. That, I think, is going to be the emerging picture. And that would actually trigger, to my mind, is that there will be a shift from permanent migration to temporary migration. Because temporary migration creates turnover of people. You can send people back if they are temporary, if they are no longer of use. You send them back in the name of brain gain, back to the countries of origin, which I think is a misnomer. And then bring in people with the latest vintage, because it is the embodiment of the latest knowledge and technology, which is actually rooted in the curriculum. Professor Ramaswamy mentioned about artificial intelligence and so on. So these are the frontiers of knowledge and technology, where we find that the countries of the global South, India, including India, have an edge in terms of the demographic dividend. The youngest country in the world is India, and it's going to be so for another 20 to 30 years. And so the generations of students would be a very, kind of a human capital that the developed world would like to acquire. I would like to suggest there that under the GCM, Global Compact for Migration, which took 16 years for Kofi Annan to start, working on it in 2002, and it was signed in 2018, after the Sustainable Development Goal did not have a clause on migration as a goal. It was through the back door that we had the GCM. I think that GCM is going to help us in creating those situations where the global partnership, the GC100 has 23 objectives, and the last one is global partnership. That, I think, is a ray of hope. And along with that, I think global compact for migration objective number 18, which is about skill transfers and certification and recognition of qualifications across countries, are going to be massively important. And of course, finally, goal number 19, which actually puts its focus on the role of the diaspora, the role of the migrants and the diaspora. And that, I think, will probably be one area where we all need to work together, to join hands, to look beyond the motherland, to look at the third country development, to the poorest of the poor countries. And that, I think, is perhaps going to be the future. But at the same time, we must not forget the destination countries like the Gulf countries, where it's still going to be the same stories being repeated unless the Colombo process or the Abu Dhabi dialogue are revived and worked upon with the new requirements, because those countries have also gone past their requirements in terms of oil economy to their becoming education economies, and their intake of from semi-skilled or unskilled is going to turn into highly skilled in 20 years' time. I'll stop there.
Right. Thank you, Professor Khadria. Very interestingly, you've pointed out about how the students could now, shift their focus to more medical professions, especially like STEM field and vaccination, and those could be the field of opening. I'm just turning to Dr. Butsch. Dr. Butsch, do you agree that Indian migrants in Germany, the students in Germany, in future are also going to follow similar paths as Professor Khadria was talking about in the USA, given that BioNTech was also coupled with Pfizer with come up with the vaccine from Germany. How is the future of Indian migration in Germany looks like for you?
Well, let's say it like this. Of course, subjects like medicine and biotechnology all of a sudden enjoy an increased attractiveness, although these were already very attractive subjects for students to study. Because, I mean, even before the pandemic, these were very lucrative ways to follow a career. But probably yes, and since we have, I think, good programs for that in Germany, which have shifted to English already. That's one of the biggest points. Yeah. When you look at foreign students coming in, we have different studies or courses which are already in English, and those are the ones who are attractive, for example, for Indian migrants. Yeah, it's interesting. I think we have the students as one part, but the other part are the high-skilled migrants. And I think that we will definitely see a change in migration regimes. I mean, this whole Corona pandemic has shown how volatile the whole migration regime we have is actually, how vulnerable migrants are, how vulnerable even short-term stayers are. I mean, I myself was in India at the time when the lockdown occurred, and I caught one of the flights going back to Europe. Right. So, and I really did not feel very well about this, with the vision of having to stay in India for a couple of months. And I think that's what all migrants, be it high-skilled or low-skilled, will make them be more cautious about their routes to their destinations. And I also am really, I think we will also see changes in the regulations, because we spoke about embodied knowledge, but I think we will also see new discourses about bodies as carriers of diseases. And so the movement of these bodies will also be restricted. And it's the sick bodies moving back in the villages, But I think there will also now be more awareness about sick bodies moving with people carrying malaria and dengue maybe to the cities. However, I think that our global economy actually relies on the movement of these bodies. And as Mr. Khalid said, that it's not really certain whether will people move back to the cities. I think they have to, because the cities don't run without those migrants. I remember when I did my PhD on access to healthcare services in India, in Pune. And I remember talking to a doctor who has running a real high paid hospital. So one of the fancy ones where you have to give your credit card before you are enter into the emergency room. And he said, look, my hospital is running on the people who live in the slum behind the door. Those are my nurses. Those are the people who come and go. So the socio-economic weak part of the society, as construction workers, as nurses, or whatever, they are needed to run the city. So the cities can't expel them. It's not possible. And likewise are the high-skilled migrants also, they are the matchmakers of the global economy. So there will be restrictions of movements, but I think those restrictions will will be very differentiating between people who are needed and people who are not needed. So I think I also don't have a crystal ball, but I think we will see a lot of changes in movement restrictions, and that will also be, for researchers interesting to look at and to look at the outcomes of this. So I think we are witnessing sad times, but also times which are interesting from the point of a researcher or chronist of these times.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Dr. Butsch. Of course, I mean, yeah, we can only predict, and thank you for your reflections. I'm now turning to Professor Ramaswamy. In view of what you said, that like maybe the future is going to be about separating labor from the worker. To some extent, well, that's going to be that is the case right now. But my question to you is, do you really think that the role of a migrant can be reduced to just a mere contributor to a workforce, be it high skilled and low skilled, and bereft of any of the migrants, any of the other participation that the migrant kind of gets into in the whole society? And do you think that the countries, the developed countries, especially where there's a lot of migration from the developing countries, can they really afford that kind of structure where the migrants are only contributing to directly to the financial growth of the economy and not really participating in the larger social and political lives? How is that going to look like? Do you think that is going to be the future really?
No, I think that's an interesting question, Amrita, but I think it's been dogging this whole debate for quite some time. Before I get to that, I also want to clarify that, for the purpose of this discussion, I think we all implicitly agree that there is a difference between what I would call involuntary migration and voluntary migration.
Right.
And one of the things we are seeing more, whether it's because of wars or like in the Middle East or tensions in other parts of the world, in what's happening in Ethiopia, or because of climate crises, there's a lot of involuntary migration that is also exploding on the global stage, which is quite different than voluntary migration, like students or workers or people who are green card holders and HP4 or H1B visas, people who seek, right? Now, so let's stay with the latter. And I think this has always been a vexing problem, and that's why I quoted that Swedish Prime Minister, that people want some work to be done, but when it's not possible to separate out labor from the worker brings everything. They bring their language, they bring their culture, they bring their food, they bring their habits. And history of the globe, whether it's Europe or Germany or US, has been filled with these struggles and assimilation and all of these debates, right? So I don't think any of us, or even the serious scholars of migration, reduce it to what a migrant contributes just to the economy, even though that might be a powerful story. And in fact, coming to the pandemic, it's very interesting that some of the lead scientists are all migrants in their home countries. And so, there's nothing more compelling than the then splashing the faces of these, whether it's in Germany or whatever, that migration adds to brain gain and not brain drain necessarily. But it is so much more complicated, as we saw in the recent US election, that even the US, which is a land of migrants and immigrants, there is so many layered and textured conversations going on about race and class and what the president has fomented. So yes, the migrants contribute an incredible amount, whether it's Silicon Valley or biotechnology or to medicine or to education. But the uncertainty comes in because the migrant doesn't look like me or doesn't look like us. So there's an us and them, right. And there's an otherism that is going on in every part of the world. And so I don't want to just belabor the US, but I think it's also even coming within my own country right now where I am in India. I remember 15, 20 years ago, had landed in Bombay. And this is during Chief Minister or the strongman Bal Thackeray's time, who the local Indian audience remembers. I remember seeing signs along the freeway or the Bombay Expressway, Bihari is not welcome. I mean, this is odd because Mumbai is the city of immigrants, if you want to call it that, or migrants within the country. Everybody has come from somewhere. And to say that there was a sort of a finger being pointed at a particular state, and as Khalid has pointed out, you know, Bihar is one of the largest exporters of internal migrants. So, but I think you play this game long enough, then everybody starts pointing a finger at everybody else. And as Gandhi said, an eye for an eye will make the world blind. Bihar will now next say that we don't want people from Odisha. I'm sitting in the state of Andhra, and Andhra says only 50% jobs for Telugus. I mean, where do you draw the line? I mean, so at some point, there has to be some sanity brought in to this discussion about at the country level or within the state level, that we can't turn into a circular firing squad about internal migration. And because jobs are at stake, opportunities are not there. And that's why people are fleeing their states to go looking for jobs. So I think this happens both at the local level, but also obviously the international level. International level, it gets very complicated very fast. But I think I brought that example from Mumbai, saying that this is also an issue domestically. I mean, in the city of Chennai, most of the, in southern India, most of the hospitality jobs or beauty parlor jobs are all going to people from the northeast of the country. And when they all left, these jobs, I mean, literally didn't get replaced. And so I think at sectoral level, there's always going to be these complications and shakeups that will happen. And I think this will dog us through the next 6 to 8 months, because not everybody is going to willingly just come back to their old occupations or willingly be received. And likewise, it is also the concept of international migration. As Dr. Butsch was saying, travel is not going to be that easy. They will not be received that easily. And I think we'll all have to just sort of feel our way through in the very tentatively over the next few months till we think back to what life may be 8 months or 12 months after this. I don't think it'll ever get back to what pre-March 2020 was, but it'll get back to a new level of whatever the equilibrium would be. And I'm okay with that, but I don't think it's going to go back magically to what March 2020 looked like just because we all have vaccines.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Ramaswamy. Quite a food for thought. And we continue this discussion in the open house, but before we open the house, I would just quickly like to draw attention to all. I've been listening to all of you, and just one thing I wanted to share is, what I understand is the whole idea of what constitutes skill needs some rethinking. We have been talking about migration, different types of migration, different skilled, unskilled, semi-skilled. But I think going beyond the theoretical frameworks of skill formation that was offered by, say, for example, R.L. Katz or Michael Mumford, largely in terms of how skill formation and what are the skill sets that are accepted in society. We perhaps need to take a whole new perspective in terms of how skills evolve with time and how the larger social and economic frameworks that we need to recognize different skills from time to time, and especially in a pandemic situation and in a post-pandemic situation. We are talking about so much about post-pandemic situation. For example, whether we are going to de-link worker from labor, whether we are going to de-skill and re-skill ourselves in terms of keeping us, ourselves relevant as a workforce. So maybe one question is, is de-skilling and expansion of reskilling going to be the future of work as one tries to accept and explore opportunities through migration? Now, as much as there have been massive job losses because of the pandemic, there also have been a certain expansion of certain sectors. For example, with the expansion of the e-commerce, home delivery of goods and services has really expanded exponentially, which wasn't really the case before, before March 2020. And I was also reading like yesterday in New York Times, and how the plastic surgeries in USA are suddenly incidence of plastic surgeries have increased because people do not really like the way they look in Zoom meetings, so they want to look different. And so maybe, who knows, we can just have suddenly a lot of demands for plastic surgeons in the USA, and USA is not being able to really respond to the demand, and we need more migrants for that. So on one hand, demand for some new skills are growing, while demand for certain existing skills are also expanding. Now, with these new developments, it is likely that in a post-pandemic situation, there will be growing demand for new skills, both in the formal and informal economy. And history is testimony, as we have been discussing, to the fact that migrants have traveled across the world to respond to different skill gaps in the host society, be it caregiving, be it IT, finance, and academic jobs. So from that standpoint, and from what we have been discussing here today, let's say if we acknowledge this pandemic as an epoch in history, in which I think we do by now, then acknowledgement of new skills and recognizing the demands for different skill expansion could possibly be a game changer for understanding the future of skill migration, how it's going to look like in a post-COVID situation. That's just my reflection from the discussion so far. So with that note, I'll stop and let's open the house, because we have quite a few questions and comments from our participants.